enough to actually detect whether or not there is H1 or N1 virus present. So something is going on in the world, and those of your listeners who were paying attention some months back during the summer, we didn't know which way this thing was going to go. I guess the last broadcast that we did, I was sort of leaning on the positive side, the optimistic side, because it seemed that H1N1 was on its way to fizzling out, that it was going to be the kind of a virus that was going to cause a mild illness in a lot of people, but very few fatalities or complications. Sure. That is right. There is something of a dispute that is taking place between the Ministry of Health and the Office of the Presidency and the Office of the Prime Minister. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of that, but basically, the President, Yushchenko, declared martial law on the heels of declaring a national public health emergency. Well, that sounds eerily similar to what we're experiencing here in the United States, where President Barack Obama, not so long ago, over a weekend, I believe the last weekend in October, declared, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't the last weekend, but the weekend before the last weekend in October, declared a state of national emergency because of swine flu. And it just seemed to be so out of step with what we perceived the reality to be at that time, where essentially, as I said earlier, it appeared as though H1N1 was this low-level virus that was just causing mild illness in a lot of people, but nothing beyond that, and did not seem to justify the hysteria that had been hyped up in the media. But now we look at what is taking place in Ukraine, and maybe the picture is changing. Maybe if we look at what is taking place in Ukraine, we're getting a prelude of what could possibly occur in other countries, including right here in the good old USA. The declaration of national emergency that Mr. Obama signed into effect gives him, as president and commander-in-chief, enormous powers, one of which is the declaration of martial law. We are also picking up reports that show that there are 80,000 U.S. troops, the Army's 5th Brigade, or I'm not quite sure of the terminology here, but basically they are under a North American command, and they are wearing insignia that resemble the insignia of the United Nations, and their purview, their scope of responsibility is not just for America, which would be bad enough to have federal troops deployed in America, which would be in violation of the Committee Comitatus Act, which was repealed a few years ago. But they also have a scope of responsibility that includes Canada and Mexico, which is what is alleged to be the pathway that we're on, the merging, in other words, of Mexico, Canada, and the United States into a new political entity that is called the Union of North America. So this is very disturbing. We know that the Department of Homeland Security, which administers FEMA, has 800 detention camps that have been made ready. Ready for what? Well, what they're talking about is they are prepared for food riots and riots due to swine flu. Well, why would anybody anticipate that there's going to be food riots or riots related to a public health emergency involving swine flu. But this is what they're doing, and the Homeland Security is in the process of recruiting 400,000 personnel to man these 800 detention camps that are spread all over the United States. So everything is in motion, moving in a certain direction that for all intents and purposes looks like we're entering into a new phase of government control that could even be a state of martial law. And so all of us have to sit back and take a hard look at the reality. The reality is not coming across the TV set. The reality is out here in the real world, and we have to pay attention to it, and then we have to act accordingly. Well, of course, one of the missing pieces of information is whether or not there was a vaccine being used in the Ukraine. The president is calling for vaccination, but exactly what happened and the number of people who got vaccinated right now is unclear. And we don't know whether the people who are infected are those who got the vaccine or whether they didn't get it, or there's a mixture. We just don't have that information. But in light of Mr. Moshe's report, I certainly, if I were in the Ukraine, I would not be lining up for a vaccine shot. And since Baxter Laboratories is one of the contractors providing vaccine in the U.S. and other parts of the world, I wouldn't line up in the U.S. either. I would get out of those lines, and I would do some other things to protect myself from influenza, such as the number one thing for all of us to do is to make sure that we are on pretty heavy doses of vitamin D. What I prefer and use in my own practice is a standard process product called Cataplex D. This is especially important for people with pigmented skin, and the darker the pigmentation of the skin, the higher the dose of vitamin D that will be needed, especially during the winter months. Skin exposure to sunlight in the summer produces a lot of vitamin D in our bodies, and that's what keeps us from getting the flu in the summertime for the most part. In the winter months, we're covered up and the sun is not as strong, and therefore this makes us extremely vulnerable to any virus that comes down the pike. The other parts of a prevention protocol